Okay, here's a quick review lecture of Chapter 7 through 11, AP United States Government Politics. And we start with Chapter 7, the public opinion in media. All right, so mass media is often discussed in AP government circles as the fourth branch of government because of their influence on policy and the policy makers, as well as on public opinion. It's made up of print media, electronic media, and the internet, like websites and blogs, which have become more and more powerful over the past 15 years, and many people consider blogs to be the watchdog of the old media forms. Just to give you a short history of the media. So it used to be that media was completely controlled by the parties. So the concept that today's media is biased or more biased than it was in the past isn't necessarily true. The media was controlled by the parties, so the parties are controlling what people thought and what they knew, and people only had one perspective. That changed a lot with the rise of the AP. The AP, or the Associated Press, in 1848 is going to be a non-biased news source that provides information, allowing many newspapers to be formed. But with the rise of the telegraph and the AP, we see the power splitting or changing over from the parties to privately owned newspaper companies, but that doesn't mean that there's not bias. It just means that the bias is now in the hands of the people who own the newspapers, people like William Randolph Hearst and Joseph Pulitzer, the yellow journalists who dominated the airwaves and the newspapers in the late 1880s, 1890s, into the 1900s, and they're the ones who had a lot of control. And the modern media era really starts with the radio, and this occurs in 1920s, and modern media today is now controlled by internet. It's controlled by news networks, MSNBC, Fox News, CNN, the internet, partisan aggregators like Drudge and Huffington Post, where people can go and get the information they want in the particular way or slant that they want. We see today's media is controlled by talking heads, sound bites, focus on scandals, and of course sensationalism, which I'll talk about later. When we think about electronic journalism, though, it had a huge impact on people's perceptions of politicians. And a major reason for this was that now people could actually hear the politicians speak. They could speak directly. The first president to really take advantage of this was FDR in 1933, but presidents before him had actually given some sort of public address. Another big factor here is that people could actually hear the whole speech and not just small snippets that were controlled by the people who ran the newspapers. Well, when it comes to getting news, most people from 1940s until 1990s got their news, though, from three main sources: ABC, NBC, and CBS, or the network news. So it's very difficult for smaller candidates or smaller members of government to actually get on the big three networks. And these were 30-minute news programs, usually every night. But that viewership has declined tremendously from 60s until presently. And now many people get their news off of the internet. They get it from newspapers, they get it from CNBC or MSNBC or CNN or Fox News. So very few people actually will watch the nightly news like they used to. Well, this decline, there's also been a decline in newspaper readership, and there's now only a few major newspapers who tend to dominate in print media today. This has put the power in the hands of a few people, and we'll talk more about conglomeration here in a second. But there's definitely far more competition in electronic media. And newspapers, many that have had to shut their doors to traditional printing newspapers, are now going to fully online newspaper. Even Newsweek, one of the most widely read magazines in the country, recently went to purely online format. That being said, America is very different than many other nations in that we have far more locally owned and operated newspapers and print media than other countries. Okay, so what are the roles of the media? Really, it comes down to three roles: gatekeeper, scorekeeper, and watchdog. gatekeeper, they decide what they're going to show. Now, this can be in a partisan way, but it's not always. It often allows sensationalism to take the first story, rather than it being that they're only showing one particular view, Democratic or Republican. But the role of gatekeeper is important. It limits interest groups, it can limit political parties, it can limit candidates, it can also lead to sensationalism. We also see scorekeeper function, which is often kind of using polls in the horse race journalism to, and this is what people tend to be interested in, who's leading at any one particular moment. And finally is the watchdog, so just kind of keeping an eye on what is actually happening within government as well as within the lives of government officials. So this is both personal and it's public actions that they are keeping a constant watch over. Okay, so let's look a little bit at the rules governing media. In short, newspapers and magazines are almost completely free from regulation. New York Times versus the United States was extremely important, basically banning federal government using prior restraint to keep newspapers from printing something they didn't want to print. They can be sued for libel, but as we'll discuss in a minute, that's a very difficult thing to do. You not only have to prove that the information is wrong, but that it was malicious and it was a reckless disregard for the truth, which is a very difficult standard. But when it comes to electronic media, there's far more rules that govern them, and the FCC, or the Federal Communications Commission, oversees media. A couple small rules that are put on media concerning government. One is confidentiality of sources does not apply in federal cases. And depending upon states, sometimes they allow confidentiality of sources. So the way this plays out is if a reporter gets information or gets someone to tell them something, they print that in the paper, and that implicates someone for a crime. That reporter could be called to court to testify, and if they refuse to because they promise confidentiality to their source, then they can be put in jail for being in contempt of court. So some states allow them to keep sources confidential. Usually the federal government does not. Another small restriction is the equal time rule, which the FCC oversees, basically requiring that broadcasters provide equal time to candidates, and if a candidate, not necessarily, or not a PAC, but if a candidate, got my power back, but if a candidate wants to air a advertisement on a local television station, the owner of that television station must provide the lowest or cheapest rate available for commercials to all candidates. So that prevents them from being able to pick and choose who they want to air ads to, or charging more to particular candidates than others. But this does not apply to super PACs or 527 groups. Okay, here's a couple specific Supreme Court cases and laws that have had a big effect on media. One is the Telecommunications Act of 1996, and this basically allows or deregulated and opened up the availability of media conglomerates to control or own far more media outlets. There were restrictions previously, but now this allows one company to own many television stations, many different newspapers, and therefore allows one person, or the person who leads this company, to have more power. When we talk about newspapers and the lack of restrictions, Neer versus Minnesota said that states can't put prior restraint on newspapers. The U.S. New York Times versus the U.S. said that federal government couldn't do that. The New York Times versus Sullivan decision in '64 made it much more difficult for you to actually prove libel. And then finally, newspapers don't have to actually give someone the chance to respond. So they could print anything they wanted to about a particular candidate or person, and they don't have to allow that person to share their views on things. When we talk about deregulation, what this has led to is just a few media companies, and therefore a few people, having a significant amount of control over what you're watching. Great examples of this would be News Corp, as you know, controls Fox, 20th Century Fox, many newspapers, like the Wall Street Journal, books, cable printing, as well as Time Warner, which is Warner Brothers, AOL, CNN, many cable content providers, like TNT. And so you have people like Rupert Murdoch, who controls News Corp, Ted Turner, who controls Time Warner, that has a significant influence over what we watch. So there's a question, though, is the media biased? While most people would say that the television stations tend to be more liberal, that may not be the case. It's not a case across the board, and it's not necessarily the truth that they are intentionally liberal. So these are some of the big questions that people ask when they think about, is the media biased? Now, if we do look at journalists' views, journalists' self-described ideology, they tend to be more liberal. Okay, but that does not necessarily mean that all media or what you're showing on television or in the newspapers is more liberal. So let's talk about media measurement of public opinion. This is another role that they play, and they do this mostly through polls, but it's important for media to differentiate not just what the public thinks, but to also look at the saliency, intensity, and stability of polls and of public opinion, and to share that with the public. Here's a couple funny maxims of media relations. And this is a reality for government and government officials and politicians. Basically, all secrets become public knowledge, so it's the more important the secret, the sooner it becomes known. So it's best to let things out into basically time when you release information, so as to hurt you the least. One idea that's often said is that all stories written about me are inaccurate, all stories written about you are entirely accurate. Obviously, that's not always true, but it is what many politicians ascribe by. The rosier the news, the higher ranking the official who announced it. This is always the reality. Whenever someone within a department does it, does something great, it's usually going to be the head or secretary of that department or the President of the United States, who will take the credit for it and be the one who announces it. One really interesting but true thing when it comes to timing and how you release things, it's always best to release things on a Saturday night or on the weekends in general, because less people are paying attention to news, more people are out, on boats or doing whatever people do on the weekends, and so it's best to release it then. And then basically, don't piss off the media. Never argue with a person who buys ink by the barrel is a very important maxim for politicians as well. Other random things about media. One question that's also often asked is why are there so many leaks? Why do you always hear anonymous sources or a vague, someone within the administration said this? And part of this reason is that with separation of powers, the branches are competing for power, and by leaking information, it demonstrates that they have some sort of power. And I mean, it's something that's done on a regular basis, just like why people tell lies, why people tell secrets, is they want to be seen in a positive light in someone's eyes. And this leads to many leaks. And the reality is with politicians, often when they give some sort of public statement, they're hiding something or they're using very vague language. So leaks are actually seen as a more genuine form of information. Okay, a couple other quick things. Here's a little cartoon that basically talks about how people trust the media less, and here's a chart to demonstrate this. If we look at the difference between the 80s and into the 2000s, more and more people continue to think news stories are often inaccurate. And this comes for a number of reasons: the distrust in media and media coverage around Watergate, and then as we see more and more news sources, there's also been a rise in sensationalism. These sex scandals and stories that are trying to get people's attention but may or may not actually be based on truth. So it has played a role in people's belief that media is less legitimate than it was in the past. Okay, so that's my overview of media. I'm going to go ahead and do more review, so watch the next video. Peace out. Bye.